There are more than 20,000 children and youth in care in this province, with almost 6,000 growing up in foster and group care as wards of the Crown. Evidence collected in the past few years shows a disproportionate number of those children are from Black and Indigenous families. So that's where we're going to start tonight as we examine Ontario's child welfare system. And joining us now to help do that, Mary Ballantyne. She's the CEO of the Ontario Association of Children's Aid Societies. Ken Richard, Executive Director, Native Child and Family Services of Toronto. Mahesh Prajapat, Chief Operating Officer, Children's Aid Society of Toronto. Kika Ojo, Project Manager, Ontario Association of Children's Aid Societies. And Sandro Contenta, feature writer with the Toronto Star. And I'm happy to welcome everybody here to our table at TVO tonight for what I think is the most important discussion about some of the most unfortunate people in our society today. I think I see everybody nodding on that one. I want to, Mary, I just want to start with you off the top. The children that we're talking about, who are they?
The children that are referred to in the numbers here are children that have come into the care of the Children's Aid Society for some reason or other, because an assessment has been made that that their parents are not able to care for them. So they're cared for either by foster parents, by kin families, or some of them have are cared for in group care. And for Indigenous children, some of them are cared for in what we call customary care.
Any orphans in the mix as well? Or is that a different thing?
That could be one of the reasons that a child might come into care, but of all of the reasons, it's probably one of it's not a very common reason for children to come into care.
Let us go through some of the numbers that we alluded to off the top here, because they are distressing, to say the least. This is a reference to the disproportionate number of Black and Indigenous children in your care. For example, 42% of children in the care of the Children's Aid Society of Toronto in 2013, the last year for which figures are available, were Black or had one Black parent, and yet only 8% of people under 18 in Toronto are Black. Continuing, 23% of Ontario children in care are First Nations, and yet only 2.5% of people under 18 in Ontario are First Nations. The rate at which white children are investigated, their family situations, it's 54 per 1,000. The rate at which Black children are the subject of an investigation, 75 per 1,000. The rate at which Aboriginal children are investigated, 126 per 1,000. I think we need to start by just understanding why that is. Mary, start us off.
Well,
and I should preface this by saying, you don't need to give me 10 reasons, because if you give me 10, we got nothing left for anybody else here. So just start us off.
Okay, well, there are at least 10 reasons.
I'm sure.
I think that that I'll maybe start with the historical piece, and that is that the child welfare system in Ontario has been in place for well over 100 years now, and really it has its roots in an approach to caring for children that has come from a colonization approach, where it's really been an approach of we are here to take care of you, and we can take care of you in a good way, and not recognizing that the communities that some of these children are coming from, the Indigenous communities and African Canadian communities, have lots of reasons and lots of capability of taking care of their children, but maybe would do it in a different way, and therefore not seen to be as good a way. And so I think over the last several years, really recognizing that that we need to be listening to more, hearing from, and assisting families from the Indigenous and African Canadian groups to better take care of their own children.
Ken, what would you add to that?
You know, the existence of so many Indigenous kids in care is not an accident. It has been, in fact, the case since child welfare in the 50s made its business the Aboriginal child. So we're not dealing with a new phenomena. These children come into care for different reasons, as Mary says, but there are some fundamental realities. One is the Aboriginal child, statistically, is in the most distress of any Canadian child. And, you know, that bears itself out in almost any statistical measure. Recent studies in child welfare particularly show a very strong correlation between children in poverty, for example, children from one-parent families, children who are really don't live the kind of Canadian dream that many people expect our children to live in. In fact, live in a continuous state of distress. So
poor housing,
that reality,
poor education,
all of
the
that,
above.
and all of that correlates strongly with why children come into care. There is other elements associated with it. You know, the child welfare system itself is based on a kind of forensic approach where we actually look at families to really determine all the deficits in that family. And sometimes, you know, there are strengths in that family that you have to have a strong understanding of what you're looking at to be able to decipher. So I think there's been a lot of misdiagnosis, misassessments of Indigenous kids. There's, many of us might call that a kind of a prejudicial approach that where you only look for information that reinforces your beliefs. And a lot of the beliefs about Indigenous children are that they need to be rescuing. That goes back to colonial times, goes back to the turn of the century with Duncan Campbell Scott and all those folks who sought to assimilate the Indigenous child. So, you know, these things kind of work in concert. They're systemic. They find themselves, though, at one child, one social worker, and a lot of weight and a lot of complexities to sort out. At the end of the day, because child welfare being what it is, the apprehension of our children seems to be the preferred mode. In fact, up until recently, it was the only mode by which child welfare delivered services. So you look at a family in poverty, in distress, inheriting some terrible colonial dynamics, and the final cap on that connection between Canada and that child is to remove them from their home. And that's a Canadian tragedy.
Understood. Mahesh, what would you add to that list?
That really, one of the things that we need to pay attention to is the difference between short-term and long-term risk. And so when we bring kids into care, sometimes we're just focusing on that short-term risk to say we're solving a problem of poverty or we're solving a problem of discipline in the immediate nature, but you introduce very serious long-term risks in terms of people being separated from their families and their communities and missing out on critical attachments, and really always weighing the balances of those two risks and landing in a place that focuses on families. Like, as children's aid societies, we do fundamentally believe that children belong at home, that they belong in their communities, and that's how we should be working. Unfortunately, as both Mary and Ken have said, we've worked in a system where, you know, the simple solution of bringing kids into care to manage risk is what's been done rather than practicing prevention.
Ika, I want to go to you next because you were the lead on a report called One Vision, One Voice. Let's start to understand what that was about. What was the mission of that report?
Well, the mission was to, I think, first and foremost, hear from the community and understand what they would have to say about their experience in child welfare.
The community being whom?
Sorry, the African Canadian community, the Black community in Ontario. And so a mix of service users and people who support service users, and just sort of, you know, even people that haven't had service with child welfare. We wanted to hear what they had to say about how child welfare has impacted the lives of African Canadians. So that was the first piece. And then the second piece around the report was to then, based on what they said, create or construct a way of doing our work and make recommendations to the system in terms of child welfare to do things differently so that we would see different outcomes.
Were you prepared for what you heard?
I mean, I think there were some surprises.
Such as?
Such as the idea that whether you live in Toronto or you live in Ottawa or you live in Thunder Bay or you live in Windsor, you have a very similar experience in relation to how systems interface with you as an African Canadian. So, you know, to hear very similar stories about the school system, about the police, about the healthcare system, and about child welfare agencies was really surprising. The level of consistency, and so I think, so I think what it points to is the fact that there are systemic issues that are also a part of the story as to why the overrepresentations happen
All over the province of Ontario.
All over the province of Ontario. And I think it goes back to some things that Mary talked about, some things that Ken talked about in terms of, you know, the history of African Canadians in Ontario, going back to before slavery and then, you know, the aftermath of slavery around sort of legalized discrimination and legalized processes of exclusion and disenfranchisement. And so our numbers are not what they are simply because of the things that happen in child welfare, but also because of how the community interacts and interfaces with a number of other systems.
Can I do one last thing just before I get Sandro in here? I've heard the Black communities, I've heard African Canadian communities.
Yes.
Are those interchangeable terms nowadays?
They are interchangeable. I think some sort of from a political perspective, using a term like African Canadian is about reclaiming our heritage as African descent people.
So that's your preference, preferred term?
Yes, in the sense from a political perspective. I mean, do I answer to Black? Yes, and I think I'm really glad you raised it because it was actually, I won't say a controversy, but it was a point that needed clarification in the community where some parts of our community haven't yet decided to call themselves African Canadian. And so there was this question of like, who are you talking about? But I am, I would argue and I would, say to our community, to my community, the Black community, that we ought to, reconsider this connection to being African heritage, African descent people, and that the use of African Canadian is a unifying term. It includes people who are Black and from the Caribbean, Black and from Africa, Black and from the US, wherever we may be from, it's a unifying term, and I think it's the right term.
Good. Then we shall use it henceforth.
Thank you.
Good. Sandro, I want to give you just an opportunity here to talk about the role your newspaper played in bringing this issue to the public's attention, because you guys did do a serious major takeout on this. What did that involve?
It basically started about 3 years ago when 2 lawyers from the Black community called up my colleague.
African Canadian community.
African Canadian community, absolutely. Called up my colleague Jim Rankin and said, there's disproportionate representation of Black kids in care, and so we met with them. And it went from there. And my other colleague, Lori Monson-Brown, has been on the team. So there's been 3 of us looking at this issue. And what we realized, of course, is that it's much more than just an issue involving African Canadian kids in care. It is really a whole number of systemic issues that are coming into play. And so
let me just jump in there. When people talk about systemic issues, I mean, that's one of those expressions that gets thrown around all the time. I'm not sure anybody knows what it really means. So what does it really mean?
Well, I mean, I think that, for instance, one of the statistics that I think is very telling about the system is that people think when we talk about child protection that it's we're saving kids from being beaten up and sexually abused, and there is some of that. But the latest statistics show the incidence, a study that is done every 4 years in Ontario, backed by the provincial government, 2% of kids in 2013 were taken away because of sexual abuse, 13% for physical abuse. So the vast majority of kids are taken from their parents for things such as mental health issues. The parent has difficulty with that, alcohol addictions, domestic violence between the parents that doesn't involve the child, neglect, sometimes due to poverty. That's systemic issues. So this is really the group of kids that we're talking about and the group of families that we're talking about, because there's very little debate about taking kids out of a family when they're being physically or sexually abused.
Of course. Yeah.
But of course, as has already been mentioned, when you're talking about that whole other group of people, you have to deal with things like prevention and family supports. That's what's really missing. And so if the issue is mental health and yet they need to wait a year or 2 to get mental health services, well, that's going to keep that family in crisis for that length of time. If the issue is neglect due to poverty, then how do we deal with poverty? I mean, that's a very systemic issue that has to do with, racial barriers in the economic system, that has to do with all sorts of other things.
Yeah.
That's what I mean by systemic.
Just to add to what Sandro's saying, I mean, the research that we did for One Vision, One Voice, the practice framework, showed that, in fact, there aren't more incidences of maltreatment for Black and white people, for example. So when the overrepresentation, thank you to the Toronto CAS for their publishing of their stats. And when you talk about 8% Black in the community, 41% Black in care, but the research shows that there aren't more incidences of maltreatment, which is a really interesting piece. Most people, if you take away the word systemic, the analysis is then that that, I mean, if there are more Black people in the system, there must be more of them doing maltreatment to their children.
Not the case.
And that's not the case. And I think so when we talk about systemic, we're talking about policies and practices that would have the system sort of focus in on that community more, or use a lens that doesn't work for that community, or a harsher lens, like a harsher use of discretion. These are some of the ways that, and I mean, similar stories you hear in policing, similar stories you hear in education.
Ken, do you think that the publishing of these statistics has given rise to a stigmatizing of the African Canadian and Indigenous communities, the likes of which Kika just said, that there's this suspicion that a lot more of this is happening in those two communities?
Using those statistics it can work for and again the issue. Yes, it can feed those who hold racist beliefs will take those statistics and mine them to further their own ideology. I don't do that, obviously. What I do is I say, folks, we got a real problem here. Our kids are poor and they're being removed by the state. This is something that we should all care about as Canadians. And without the identification of the overrepresentation of the Indigenous child, that argument is not as strong. So I support the gathering of those statistics, but I also support diligence associated with how they're used.
Mahesh, I'm just going to ask this directly. Do you think children's aid societies do a good enough job for Indigenous and/or African Canadian kids in crisis?
I think it's clear that we have to do better. You know, I think it's very clear that we have to do better. These numbers, when you look at them, are really humbling, and we should be holding ourselves accountable to say, you know, what are the services that we're providing? What are the choices that we're making? What are the discussions that are happening in offices between supervisors and workers that are making these decisions? And how can we better support those processes and those decisions? And so, the honest answer is that we have to do better. Like, you can't look at these types of numbers that are so overrepresentative and say that everything is okay. And I think, we need to say that we need to do better quickly, that we can't, create strategies that are going to take 2 or 3 years, but we have to look at a helpful, immediate response that really makes it feel like we're moving forward.
Well, Marion, let's consider that. I mean, if memory serves, about $1 billion in the budgets of all the children's aid societies across the province, all 47?
1.4, yeah.
1.4, okay, to do the work that you have been tasked to do. What prevents you from doing a lot of the things that were just mentioned?
Well, I think that many things are actually starting to happen, and I think we are on a few different levels seeing things happen. There is the individual caseworker doing their work with their supervisor, as Mahesh is talking about. So making sure that the children are being provided with cultural resources so that their experience in care is at least better is one of the big pieces. But also working with families to ensure that they have the supports that they need so that children can go back home or not come into care in the first place. But I also think, and these are the pieces that take a little bit more time that will actually help the caseworkers, is looking at things from a broader perspective. So what is the legislation doing, the rules and policies that caseworkers need to work with? What do they need to look like to better assist caseworkers in doing their work? And a big part of it is recognizing and finding ways to have the responsibility and the ownership of the care for children being in the communities from which those children came.
Is that happening, Kika?
Well, that's what we're moving towards. I mean, I think there are some organizations, but I think that the African Canadian community would say that as a community, they're underfunded in terms of when they try to set things up for themselves, that they don't get the funding. And so we end up in a situation where we're depending on the system more than we want to.
So the funding you're referring to there is what, part of that $1.4 billion or something else?
No, it would be alternative funding, often from governments or from other, funders like, I don't know if I can name any, but other funders that provide, grants, et cetera, to spaces like that. And I think sometimes the things that they want to do aren't seen as the right thing or the priority issue, right? And so that's another loss for the community or another missed opportunity.
So I really want to make sure I understand this. So if more investments were being made upstream, then there would be less of a need for the kind of money that's being spent downstream to clean up problems after they've already happened. Is that what you're thinking?
That's the sort of macro idea. Yes. I think. I think, like I said, the thing is that there are systemic issues. Like, here's the word
There's
systemic
that word again,
right? That cause African Canadian and Indigenous families to come to the attention of a system like child welfare more often than other people. I mean, I'll just give you a really quick example. The poverty piece, stats that I think have already been raised at this table. It begs the question, I always ask, when was the last time we opened in this particular very ritzy neighborhood that we all know of, say in Toronto, right? And it's like, well, I can't remember when we last opened in that area.
Open? What do you mean open?
Opened a case.
Opened a case,
right?
okay.
Opened a case.
So in other words, they're not banging down the doors of Rosedale or Forest Hill.
Right, and so the question is, that makes people chuckle is, does that mean that rich people are naturally and inherently great parents?
We know that's not true.
People know that's not true. And so when we talk about systemic, this is kind of the way to kind of capture it for sort of the layperson. We're saying, why then is there such attention on this group? And there's a number of reasons. How they come to the attention of their school teacher, or what the presumptions are about the missed lunch. We have stories around the missing lunch. Maybe it was missed that day.
That's systemic.
Yes,
that gets into that.
It
Okay.
adds to
Can I
it.
make a comment?
Please, Ken, go ahead.
Well, it's just maybe a little bit of good news. There has been innovation in child welfare, and I'm pretty proud to say some of that innovation has come from the Indigenous sector. There is, while we talk about so many children in care, increasingly those kids in care are not really disappearing the way they used to. Back in the day, these kids would be adopted out to southern, as far as Europe, southern states, terrible, tragic stories. Now we have more likely an opportunity for a child to stay within their community and often directly within their extended family. So you have to ask the question, is a child who's in care of their auntie actually in care? Or simply finding a different familial arrangement with some government subsidy, which is how I look at that.
Maybe we need a different expression then to describe that situation.
Well, we need to change the language of child welfare. Yeah. We need to change the funding. Now, you're alluding to certain things that, where I live. I run an agency that is multi-service, and, we do so much good work when we have the opportunity to develop preventive programs, as you call it, upstream programs. Mm-hmm. And, on the poverty item, there is programs that can alleviate or mitigate the worst effects of poverty. I run Head Start programs for kids where they get a lot of stimulation, a lot of leg up to go to school. I'm really encouraged by the federal government's institution of the child benefits and the potential for that. So to actually give money to poor people sounds simple. It's incredibly difficult to do based on the constraints of our inherited Victorian sensibilities. But as we're unfettering ourselves from that colonial dynamic, you're going to see a lot more, hopefully, direct supports to parents who need $40 to buy milk. So when the children's aid shows up and says, "Where's the milk?" they're going to say, "It's right there." So it's that kind of simple stuff.
Gotcha. Sandro, I want to ask you about how well African Canadian and Indigenous kids, once they're finished with the Children's Aid Societies and they are trying to reintegrate themselves back into their homes, how well that happens.
Well, it's difficult to say, at least from where I stand, because there's very little data that tracks how kids are doing in the system when we take them into care and how they're doing when they're sent back home.
There's no follow-up?
Certainly not on a statistical level. Clearly, there would be follow-up of caseworkers checking in to see, how they're doing. But we just don't know. And that's part of the problem with the child welfare system at both levels, at the ministry level and at the Children's Aid Society levels, is that nobody's keeping track. And so what we know is that many, many cases are reopened. And so we know that children go back home, and in many circumstances, particularly at the Toronto Children's Aid Society, they reopen more cases than they open. So clearly the child is going back home, there are still problems to deal with, and so they have to reopen the case within a year perhaps. So we know that happens a lot, but we haven't really dug in to see exactly why that's happening.
Mahesh, I'm sorry, do we need more follow-up there?
I don't think we reopen more cases than we open, but I think we reopen a certain percentage of cases, but it's certainly nowhere near the number of new cases that we have.
Would you know how many, I guess recidivism is the wrong word, but you know what I'm saying. What percentage of cases would be repeat cases?
I don't have the exact stat in terms of exactly how many.
Would you say too many?
I wouldn't say too many, because I think a lot of the cases that are reopened are cases that are related to things like parent-teen conflicts, where those things are chronic issues, cases of domestic violence, where children are exposed to situations of violence, which those things are again, the word systemic, but issues that are chronic and repeating, and so they cause families to come to our attention over a repeated period of time.
Okay, hold that thought then, because we've got about a minute left here, and I want to give Kika the last word on this. This astonished a lot of people when Premier Kathleen Wynne said, I've got my eye on this problem, I've heard what people have had to say, and I'm prepared to, her words, blow up the system and reconfigure it if need be. What did you infer from that?
Oh gosh, what did I infer? I mean, I think there was a lot to it. I think that it means that there's so many pieces to this puzzle that we need to sort of take the puzzle apart and put it back together the way it needs to be to serve the communities that we serve well and better. And that we need to base it on what they have to say, we need to base it on their best interests, and we need to, we have historically not worked. We have systemic partners like the police, like education, and notice I keep raising those two spaces. And I think that we have to engage them differently in a conversation about systemic issues like racism, which we have come to know and believe is one of the big pieces to why the numbers are the way that they are. But we can't do that work alone. We have points within our system that need to be sort of change how we do our work, but we also need our partner systems to also be thinking differently and be thinking about how they look at those same bodies and how they impact our outcomes ultimately.
Okay, we are going to take a short pause in our conversation here. Sandro and Mary, we're not quite done with you yet, so you two stick around. I want to thank Kika for coming on the program tonight, along with Ken Richard, Kika Ojo, Ken Richard, and Mahesh Prajapat from the Toronto Children's Aid Society. So thanks to the three of you for helping us with this conversation tonight. But we're going to continue it now with a look at how the province plans to overhaul the system. We're going to switch up our guests a little bit, but we would love to hear from you on this, and here's how to contact us. Watch this. We have been talking about some of the problems facing Ontario's child welfare system. These and other issues have prompted the provincial government to begin an overhaul of the system, including exerting greater control over the province's 47 children's aid societies. Joining us now to explore the proposed changes, we welcome Erwin Elman. He is the Provincial Advocate for Children and Youth. Kiris Garabagi. He is the Director and Associate Professor in the School of Child and Youth Care at Ryerson University. Richard Marcano, Youth Amplifier for the Office of the Provincial Advocate for Children and Youth. Love that title. And we welcome back Mary Ballantyne, the CEO of the Ontario Association of Children's Aid Societies, and Sandro Contenta, feature writer with the Toronto Star. Welcome to the three of you who are joining our conversation right now. Kiris, let me just start with you. We want to, we're going to put these numbers up here, and then I'll come to you first with this. Here's the situation right now on the ground. In Ontario, there are 47 designated children's aid societies. There are 9 children's aid societies that are Aboriginal agencies. 3 of those are religious, 2 Catholic, 1 Jewish. More than 171,000 calls and referrals were made, more than 80,000 of which required investigations. Youth aged 16 to 18 are the highest represented age group in care, and more than a third of adoptions were by the foster family that the child had been living with. All right, with all of that in place now, let's ask the big question here, which is the current child welfare system in the province of Ontario working?
That's just a little question, I think, but
that's a big question.
I think the quick answer to that is no, absolutely not. It's not working, and I think the most obvious reason why it's not working is because the overwhelming, well, I wouldn't say the overwhelming majority, but many young people tell us it's not working, and I think the starting point of any discussion about child welfare ought to be the voice of young people. And we have asked them for years, in fact for decades, and they have given us the same message. This system is not meeting their needs.
What are their needs?
And I should, let me just quickly add that it's not only not meeting their needs, it's also not meeting their desires or the things that inspire them or their vision of their own future. And that is not to say that that's true for every young person who is in care, but it is true for many young people in care, and it is true for almost every young person in care at some point in time. And so young people who grow up in care very often grow up in a very fragmented way with a great deal of uncertainty and with really no safe place to raise their voices and to say, this is not happening for me, or I don't feel in control over what's happening for me, or I don't really feel like there is a safe place where I can go and raise my concerns.
Let me follow up with Richard. He talked about the system as it's currently constituted not meeting the needs of Ontario's young people. What are those needs?
Those needs are just like the need to have a safe environment, support to progress in life and to transition out of care. When you talk about needs, something for the Black community I can talk about, the needs that are not being met is their values and cultural beliefs. Those needs are not being met when they enter the child welfare system.
Talk about hair. I read articles about, Sandra did this article about well, it's about hair. Go ahead.
Yeah, so a big issue that I'm finding just working alongside youth is they're not getting enough funding for their hair. Black youth have different hair textures than other youth who do not identify as Black. And when a youth asks their worker for more funding for a proper hair treatment so they can take care of their hair, it feels like the worker just minimizes their needs and they don't see the value of it. They don't feel like it's an important need, and which causes the youth to feel sometimes isolated.
Well, the example I heard was that there has actually been attempts to straighten the hair of some African Canadian youth, because that way it's easier for the family involved to take care of it.
It's easier for the family to take care of it, and it's easier for them to take care of it. And also, you think of it's assimilation, right? They're coming from a household where the parents have, in most cases, are enriched with their culture. Then they're brought into a foster home where the foster home and the foster parents and the child may not have the same beliefs, right? So then the child is forced to conform with their values and their beliefs. So that, in some cases, straightening their hair, attending different religion, practicing different religious practices that they not necessarily practice when they're at home.
Gotcha.
And just to add on to that, and that's an issue when they're getting reintegrating back home. People ask, like, okay, then how is the relationship when they go back home? In some cases, not so good, because you have the child coming back home with their families who this child now adapted a different religious and core beliefs than their families, which can cause different problems within the household.
Understood. Erwin, I want to go to you next, because basically your job as the provincial advocate for children and youth is to look out for young people in the province. So how well does the child welfare system in this province do at what it's supposed to do?
Well, let me say my job is to ensure that young people's voices are heard by decision makers. And when I listen to Kiris, it warms my heart to hear what he's saying, because I agree 100% that young people need to be involved in reshaping the system. And then I listen to Richard, and I think he brought us to this point in this province. Richard and other young people 5 years ago held hearings. You had them on your show, held hearings at Queen's Park. 700 people came. They opened up a system which was closed, with due respect to the Toronto Star, which has been a natural advocate too for children in this province. I have to give them respect. But young people brought us to this point by courageously, on your show and others and at the legislature, saying, we know you're trying, but this is the way it is for us, and it's not good enough, and it's not working.
Mary, let me play devil's advocate here and say, Kiris just said we have to listen to the voice of youth when we design the child welfare system in Ontario. Somebody watching this right now might say, what does a 10-year-old know about what he or she needs? We have to listen to the experts. What would you say to that?
I think it is a combination, as with any, with any work that we do with children and families, and any parent with their children needs to be listening to their child very much, but also needs to be using some good wisdom that comes from being an adult parent. So I think there is that definite combination that needs to happen. I think the children that are in the youth the youth that are being talked about here are youth that are actually often older than 10. So they may have been in the system from the time they were 10, but then they start to grow up in the system, so they've really got some good insights for us. The one piece I do want to add, though, is that most of the children that are served by the child welfare system, over 90% of them, actually are in their own homes. And I think one of the things that we learn a lot from hearing about the children that have come out of their own homes is that we need to work a lot harder to keep them in their own homes, or at least keep them in their communities. And I think that while Ontario has by far the large majority within their own families, we need to work a lot harder to ensure that more of these kids are within their own families, because no child is ever meant to have to leave their own family, and particularly to have to leave their own culture. So what do we need to do to, as the Children's Aid Societies, but also system as a whole? The supports that families need, with issues of poverty, how do they work with those? The treatment needs that adults and children need so that they can stay together, and the services available for that. It's a very large piece that we need to look at, so that children don't need to come into the care of the Children's Aid Society.
Erwin, you wanted to add.
to say this, and maybe provocative. I don't think we have a child welfare system. I think we have a child protection system, and we have many ministries, many jurisdictions, many services offering supports to family that are not organized and not developed, and there's no system. We hear from the Children's, and they're right, we can't do it all, but they can't have their cake and eat it too. It's a 100-year-old system, Victorian, as we've discussed. We need to think of something different. And so
blow it up and start again?
No, the Premier said blow it up and perhaps start again, or she mused about it. She said it in frustration and anger that I feel. Certainly, I share it with her every day. I read the Toronto Star. I've been to Caitlin Sampson's inquest. I've been to Jeffrey Baldwin's inquest. I know about mother risk. I listen to young people every day. I had enough, and so have they. Something is wrong, and it's not okay anymore. The open system means it's not okay. The ministry and the Children's Aid Societies, they cannot solve this problem. It needs to be opened up to others, and that's what young people did. There are many people engaged and wanting to have a conversation about how do we build a system, not destroy a system. So we got the Children's Aid, it's child protection. We want to talk child protection and all the flaws in that, and we can, and it needs to improve. But we want to talk child welfare. We need to make 3 statements as a province. 1, we need to say to our children, in my lifetime never been said, we will protect you. 2, we need to say to our children and youth in this province, every child and youth, you will have what you need when you need it in order to thrive, everyone. And to all families, my family, foster families, adoptive families, that have been created, we need to say thank you, we've got your back, whatever you need to do right by your child, you have. From there, if the government takes that leadership, we can build a system that can move to achieve that. But I'm tired of listening to the Children's Aid Societies and the ministry go behind closed doors and try and figure this out. Those days are over.
I just want to jump in on that point, and also you made a reference to the experts earlier. And there are some real questions about who this expert is. I spent, along with some colleagues, a number of months in the province looking at residential services. And, we met with hundreds of people, all of whom are by someone designated as an expert in something. But we didn't see the expertise. It is really clear that while there are many good people, hardworking people, people with the best of intentions involved in trying to make life okay for young people, nobody really has the answer. And without young people really driving that process, not just getting a seat at the table and occasionally being allowed to say something, which is frankly what very often the practice is, but without young people actually driving that process and at least challenging those so-called experts to say, don't just give me the rhetoric, make my life better, because my life is not good, we will not get anywhere. I will tell you some of the things that experts do. So we heard lots and lots of stories about a worker coming, telling a kid we're going out for lunch, and instead taking the kid to a placement somewhere. We've heard stories about a young person being at camp, and on the way home from camp being told, you're not going to this foster home anymore, you're going to a different foster home.
So they got lied to.
Yes, they got lied to, probably not with the intention of lying, but probably because a whole bunch of experts came together and thought this was a good thing to do. And so there is some trauma that builds up when you run a way of being with young people in this fashion. Because that young person tells another young person who tells another young person. And frankly, the expectation on the part of young people is that this system is not going to make my life okay.
Mary, do you have a trust problem?
Does the child welfare system have a trust problem? For sure, for sure. I think that while the issues that that are talked about here there are those kinds of those kinds of experiences that children have had. There are also lots of experiences where children have appreciated and needed the services, but is there lots that we can be learning, and does it need to be guided more by the voice of youth? Absolutely. And I think that is being built into the system. And
well, that's what I want to know. Let me get to Sandra.
Yeah.
There's a huge trust problem because the system is completely unresponsive. And that's one of the striking things you learn when you start digging into the system is that, and by that I mean the Children's Aid Societies and the ministry, parents in African Canadian communities have been complaining for years that their kids were overrepresented, years and years and years. And it's only in the end of September that the minister finally said, we're going to direct Children's Aid Societies to collect race-based data. Part of the problem is that we're dealing with a constituency, i.e. the people that are involved in Children's Aid Societies who are poor and marginalized, and they don't have a voice. There's nobody out on the streets protesting in favor, for these people to get changes. And so they're the voiceless, and it's easy for governments to overlook them. The other part is that you have Children's Aid Societies that are completely funded, 100% practically, by the government. So they're in a difficult situation as far as trying to be advocates for people and biting the hand that feeds you in a certain sense and making life uncomfortable for the ministry to act, And so very simple things, and the system is full of details like this. Children are being moved often within the system. I think the last study I saw of ONLAC, which is a provincial survey that is done every year, about 25% of kids are moved, change schools more than 5 times. 25% of kids who have been in the system more than a year are moving more than 5 times. What happens when they go to another school? They spend weeks sometimes waiting to get into that school for various bureaucratic reasons, right? So they're missing school, and then we wonder why more than half of the kids in care don't graduate high school.
And something I can add to that.
Please, Rich.
Once a kid who's brought into the child welfare system and they're involved in the education system, once this education system knows this child is brought in, is involved with the child welfare system, they're often forgotten about, all right? Now, here's a scenario. You have 2 kids, both who are falsely accused for something they didn't do, and they both get suspended. One comes from a family that supports them. One comes from the child welfare system. The child that comes from the child welfare system is not going to have someone to advocate for them, all right? Now, the one that has parents that are advocating for them, that's going to be the school's first concern, all right? So it leaves the child who's involved with the child welfare system pushed to a side. And that's how the child who's in the child welfare system doesn't graduate and eventually gets involved with the youth criminal justice system. And that's where you see numbers of overrepresentation of youth who are involved with the child welfare system pipeline down into the youth criminal justice system.
Does that happen much?
It happens quite.
It happens quite a lot. Mary, all right, so
Sorry, I was going to say that's the perfect point because so a very simple fix would be to simply direct schools to say, let's give them 5 days maximum before they have to accept a child who's been transferred from school through no fault of their own. Give them maximum 5 days and you have to take that child into the new school. That hasn't been done. This is a problem we know has been on the table for years. It's a simple fix. You just need the ministry to direct schools. First of all, they have to talk to the education ministry, get together,
that's the thing, right?
direct schools to do it. It isn't done. And the system is full of examples like this that are simple fixes that don't happen because it's unresponsive.
But this requires one ministry to talk to another ministry, and as we know, governments work in silos.
Actually, it's curious, right? Because even back when in opposition days, Minister Matthews, when she was an opposition member, had a private member's bill to do just that. But now, where is that? And that, to me...
I don't think she ever was in opposition.
I believe that there was a private member's bill to do that. And to me, when that hasn't been done, that simple simple change that could affect the lives of a child, it speaks to our caring, I suppose. At least it speaks to what young people tell me is that they feel invisible, that there's this sense of invisibility to these young people, that even something as simple as that could change their lives isn't done, which they may interpret as caring. Maybe that's overstating it, but certainly it's a sense of an invisibility that exists.
Can I just quickly also say it is absolutely true that there is a lot of good work that happens, and that there are many instances where young people have a good experience, where something works out well, and certainly there are a lot of good people trying to bring to bear those good things across children's aid societies in Ontario. But it really is difficult to hear this message that 90% of the time we're doing okay. Well, what about the other 10% of the time? Would you drive a car that breaks down 10% of the time? Would you do anything in life that is good, that isn't good 10% of the time? It's not okay. So if a system is chronically at its height, at its best case scenario, operating in such a way that 10% of people are not getting the service they want, then it's not a matter of some tweaking. It's a matter of there is something just profoundly wrong. And I just want to point out that who is part of those 10% is not a choice of the kids. They don't get to choose. It's a matter of luck. You either are or you aren't, and you have no choice in the matter whatsoever.
And let's do the math here. 10% of the kids in care, that's 2,000 kids.
That's a lot of kids.
That is a lot of kids. Okay, I mean, I know you're here representing all the children's aid societies across the province. To whom are you accountable? All of your children's aid societies, to whom are you accountable?
Well, they're accountable to the government for their funding. But the premise of the system in Ontario is that the local children's aid societies are made up of boards of directors from their local communities. And so those local community boards do see themselves as also accounting back to the community for the work that is done there.
But for the 10% of the kids who are either falling through the cracks or who are being inadequately served here, who do they complain to get justice?
Well, and I think this is where, the Child's Advocate Office has done a good job of amplifying their voice. I think that we also have a program through our association where children's, the voice of children has been heard, and several things have happened as a result of that.
Which is an
Studies,
excellent program, by the way.
Yeah.
It's an
Excellent.
excellent
And
program.
who do you, when people complain to you, what do you do?
Well, young people can call us and we listen, develop an advocacy plan, and try and push forward. It's only recently we've received any investigation powers into the activities of the Children's Aid, and we'll be able to do that if parents call us, and they've used the the Child Family Service Review Board, which is also a complaint mechanism that exists for people being served by the Children's Aid Societies. But your question is key because for me, there's been decades of a dance, and Sandro referred to it, between the Children's Aid Societies and the ministry. And it was a push-pull about who's responsible. So the ministry might say, and I think they're feeling this, we give them directives and they just don't do what we tell them to. Not that we have any data to know whether they're doing it. We hear it from young people or from others. And then the system itself says, well, there's two things. They often say, sorry, Mary, but there's a dazed and confused answer, which is, well, we're so confused. We don't know what they want us to do, or we have no money. And so there's a dance back and forth, and the young people drop through the middle. And that dance, I believe, needs to end. And so I'm hoping next week or weeks after, soon, the ministry changes the Child and Family Service Act to say, no, it's our responsibility. It's our call. We need to know what's happening to young people in care, and quite frankly, the kids living in their homes, because just because a child welfare agency doesn't get another call back, another referral, doesn't mean those kids are doing well, which is back to we have no family support system in the province.
Let me ask Richard about this. I mean, you're dealing with kids every day in this province, right?
That's correct.
So do they know who's got their back in all of this?
In most cases, they don't, sadly. They're not educated on who to call if their rights are not being met, if they have a complaint, which is really sad because there are stuff in place, but there's just a lack of education that's going to these youth. And
how do you help them?
Just help them. How do I help them?
Yeah.
Just going out and presenting to youth and just letting them aware of our office and what we can do for them.
And what, at the end of the day, can you do for them?
we can help them advocate for their rights and their needs to be met.
Does that work?
It depends on the circumstances and the case, but in most cases, I think it works. Because if it leaves the youth empowered, right? It gives them a voice, it gives them hope.
Erwin.
Well, I was going to say that I was just on a listening tour the last 10 days and meeting young people, and I can think of two young people. One who said, frankly, asked her, you know, I'm coming, just listening to you, you're not complaining to me, I just want to know about your lives, and I wonder if this is useful to you. And she said, well, what Richard said, when people listen, especially people we think are important, it makes our lives meaningful. And then she said, and when we have a voice, it makes us feel fearless. And if any group of children need to feel fearless, it's children who are plucked from their homes, out of their communities, placed in home, moved from home to home to home. They need to find a way of being fearless. And in the system itself, we need to create a culture where we listen to children, put them at the center of everything we do. It's about Caitlin's principle, which came out of Caitlin's inquest.
You should, you know what, take 20 seconds and just tell people who Caitlin was and why she is at the center of all of this.
Caitlin Sampson was a child who died a horrible death at the hands of her caregivers.
She was beaten to death.
Beaten and starved to death. She was so injured, it's not clear in some ways how she died. And she was found, and she was an open case with at least 2 child welfare agencies. But there was other points of protection, I call them, the school and first responders involved in her life. And in the inquest, we learned that we just missed her. The system just missed her. Nobody really spoke to her about how she was doing.
Let me follow up with Sandro. There is a bill before the legislature of Ontario right now. Monique Taylor, Hamilton New Democrat MPP, who has proposed, I think it's called Caitlin's Principle. Yeah, Caitlin's Principle. What would that do if and when that bill passes?
I'm not quite sure what it would do, actually. I'm sure Erwin would know better than me.
So for me, and young people and staff who were involved with our office at that inquest we had standing, came up with that principle. And for them, they wanted to ensure that children were at the center of everything. So it seems obvious, but it couldn't be missed again that somebody would talk to the child. But it also goes further. It says everything Kiris was saying, but it forces it fundamentally in legislation that if you're going to move a child, they participate in that decision. If you're going to place them in kinship care, they have a say in that decision. Not decide, they participate in that decision.
They've got a voice.
They have a voice, and quite frankly, the system has no capacity to deliver that, even if it's passed. And that's where we need to do some work to put children at the center.
Let's go, Sheldon, to Board 3. Here's Martin Redcon writing in the Toronto Star last year. Conceived in the industrial age, today's Children's Aid Society system seems oblivious to the digital era. Without a secure foundation, the entire architecture of Children's Aid is crumbling. Its computer system is dated and dilapidated. Too often, CAS workers fail to communicate with one another, confer with a child's teacher, or check records of parental abuse. What seemed progressive in the late 1800s is simply regressive today. Children's Aid needs to be rescued from itself. Okay, Mary, I got to give you an opportunity to speak to that.
Well, where do you start? There are definitely issues that need to be addressed, and they are not issues that we can just take one at a time and expect that we're going to see the change that needs to happen. There's a variety of different opinions of exactly how that ought to happen. Hearing the voice of young people, having that at the center, absolutely critical. The role that Children's Aid Societies play individually, lots of pieces there that need to be looked at. But the system more broadly is another key piece. It can't just happen by focusing on Children's Aid Societies. Education, health, mental health, poverty, government policies, practices, procedures, directives, all need to be examined as part of this. And it is not as simple as, put a few of these things in place and it will be fixed. It is much more global. Who is looking at the global system, I think, is a very big question. And that is a question that we don't have a good answer for in Ontario. And so all of the people that you've had on your show today, we all know each other. We talk on a regular basis. And yet there is no one body that is actually looking at this. So probably that is one of the first things that we need to figure out. Should that be the government, just the government? I think the Children's Aid Societies would say government a very key agent, but also the people that deliver the service every day, key agents. The people that are receiving the service every day, key agents. How do we bring these different parties together in a way that will look at the whole system, not just the individual little parts?
And we hope we have whetted the public's appetite for more information about this, as we hope we do on this program. Mr. Director, wide shot, please, as we thank everybody, Mary, Sandro, Richard, Erwin, Kiris, for appearing on our program here on TVO tonight. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.